Thank you. So I'd like to welcome everyone today to today's BC Support Unit webinar, which will be about an hour in length. My name is Pat Atherton. I'm responsible for training and capacity development here at the unit. Our webinar today is a unique and innovative idea here at the unit where we're running a journal club to take a look at a real-world clinical trial article. And our discussion today is going to be led by Dr. Penny Brasher. Penny is a senior research scientist at the Center for Clinical Epidemiology and Evaluation and an associate member of the Department of Statistics at UBC. She's the statistical editor for the Canadian Journal of Anesthesia and has served on several grant review committees and ethics boards. Her research interests include clinical research methodologies, secondary use of administrative data, and statistical education. We're going to be recording today's webinar for anyone who might be interested in listening into this journal club later on. And that's why you've heard us talk about recording at the very beginning. So with that, I'd like to begin our webinar with an acknowledgement that we are invited and welcomed to the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nations. And we appreciate their hosting us today as we run this webinar. Over to you, Penny.
Okay, well, thank you, Pat. So just welcome everybody who's joining us. Most of the names I know, not all of them. And I thought I would just start with a little bit of history, I guess I would call it. Pragmatic trials have become quite a talking point recently, but actually, they were first mentioned way back in Canada's centennial, 1967, by two French statisticians, Swartz and Lelouch. And they talked about what they called explanatory trials and pragmatic trials. And that appeared in the Journal of Chronic Diseases. And the way they defined it was that in an explanatory trial, you're basically testing a causal research hypothesis, whereas in a pragmatic trial, you're comparing treatments under the conditions in which they would be applied in practice, and you're doing this to really choose what care option would be the best. They talked about a few domains where explanatory and pragmatic trials are different. One is in terms of the assessment of the results. In explanatory trials, quite often it can be a clinical biomarker or perhaps a surrogate outcome for a clinically important outcome, whereas in pragmatic trials, it's typically a clinical outcome that's important to patients. They talked about the difference in the choice of subjects between explanatory and pragmatic trials, with explanatory trials having quite restricted eligibility criteria versus pragmatic trials. And they also talked about the setting where the trials would take place. So they sort of talked about these three domains. And one of the things that they argued at the time, and this is quite a while ago now, was that there was a mismatch between the design of the trials and the way the results were being used, in that the trials were designed as explanatory trials, and yet the results were being used to guide everyday practice. And so we can think of pragmatic trials as trials that are used to get evidence to better guide physicians and policymakers in choosing optimal treatment. And I think it's interesting that people talk about evidence-based practice, but when we think about pragmatic trials, we're talking about really practice-based evidence. So it's a little bit of a background. That original paper was only cited 7 times in basically the next 10, 12 years. But if you look at the Web of Science today, you'll find that it's being cited 30 to 40 times every year, so indicating the renewed interest in pragmatic trials. It was also reprinted in 2009 in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, and interestingly was simultaneously published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And if you look at the history of pragmatic trials, there's actually a lot of involvement by Canadians early on, so it's quite interesting. And in that edition of the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology in 2009, I think it was May, there was a paper by Thorpe et al. That talked about something called the Precede Tool. And Precede stands for Pragmatic Exploratory Continuum Indicator Summary. And the idea is that, you know, no trial is truly explanatory and no trial is purely pragmatic, but there's some bit of both in everything, but some are towards one side of the scale and others to the other side. And so they developed this tool and a scoring system to sort of show how pragmatic a trial might be. They took the 3 domains of Schwartz and Lache and changed it into 10 domains. More recently, in BMJ 2015, I think, it's been refined again. There's the Precede tool, which has 9 domains. And I'm hoping John or Larry, whoever's there, could show the slide of the Precede tool. So thanks for that. So hopefully everybody can see this, and you should be able to make your screen a little bit bigger. So this is a tool they've developed that measures sort of how pragmatic is a trial, and you can see it results in this little diagram. So the scores go from 1 to 5, where 1 is, basically it's a explanatory trial. 5 is it's a pragmatic trial. They use a Likert scale, so very explanatory, rather explanatory, equally explanatory, pragmatic, and then rather pragmatic and extremely pragmatic. And this is actually the Precede tool used in a trial that I'm doing with a collaborator at JF Strong. And so here are the domains when we want to think about how pragmatic is a trial or how explanatory is a trial. These are the domains that we think about. So again, there's eligibility, who was selected to participate in the trial. There's how was recruitment done, the setting. So often we do trials in tertiary care centers, even though the treatment may be applied in primary care. Then the organization, i.e. what expertise and resources do you need to deliver the intervention. Flexibility of things, you know, do people have to take all of their tablets or all of the intervention, etc. And then again, how much, how closely are we following patients? Usually in explanatory trials, we follow people very often and quite routinely, rather than routinely. The primary outcome, again, is it relevant to the participants, or is it just a biochemical outcome or something? And then finally, primary analysis. In a pragmatic trial, you would always be doing an intent to treat analysis, because you are really saying, how well is this going to work in practice? If we put it out there, some people will take it, some people won't, as opposed to an explanatory trial where you're likely to do both an ITT and a per protocol analysis. So that's the Precede tool, and you may want to keep that in mind when we're talking about the paper today by Hilton et al. That appeared recently in the Journal of Oncology Practice. So I'll just stop and ask if anybody has any questions or want any clarification before we go on. Okay, I'll take that as a no. Okay, so getting to the paper that was selected for the journal club today, it's a little bit of a hybrid, I would say, because it's talking about pragmatic trials in general and also talking about a particular pragmatic trial. So just in summary, these investigators were looking at a clinical trial of 2 interventions of optimal, to look at prophylactic treatment for preventing febrile neutropenia in patients undergoing adjuvant chemotherapy for cancer of the breast. And they found that the people were doing different things in practice. There's quite a bit of variability in practice, that there was no definitive answer to which was better, and that, interestingly, like most pragmatic trials, one of the interventions cost thousands of dollars, 12,000 I think they said, and the other one cost $100. So they also have very different toxicity profiles. So their idea was to do a pragmatic trial comparing these two interventions to inform practice going forward. And they developed this program they call REACT, Rethinking Clinical Trials Program. And they list about 7 or 8 things that they thought about when developing this program. Some of them are pragmatic, and some of them would apply to both pragmatic and explanatory trials. In particular, I think having a simple study endpoint, the integrated consent model they talk about, randomization really in the clinic and by the physician, real-time data capture using electronic data records are elements that are really are necessary in a pragmatic trial. So the trial that they talk about, they had a pilot, and the consent was done by just a verbal consent, so just your typical conversation between the physician and the patient, although there was a script that had to be followed. And then the consent was just documented by dictation into the electronic medical record. So that's a bit different from your typical trial where we have pages and pages of a written consent that people go through. The MD was able to randomize the patient in the clinic electronically, rather than quite often we have a research coordinator go through the consent process and access the randomization. And then they had hoped to get the clinical endpoints of febrile neutropenia and treatment-related hospitalization from the EMR, but that didn't work out, so they developed an automated email system that was basically sent to the physician when they were expecting the patient to come in, and just asking whether either of these two clinical endpoints had been realized in the patient. So that's a summary of the trial. If you read the paper to the end, you'll find out that it worked pretty well. They had very high participation rate. 66% of patients were randomized, which is, I would say, unheard of. And the patients were very satisfied with the consent process and the study as a whole. Interestingly, the same group of individuals did another trial like this in triple-negative breast cancer and had the exact reverse experience. They were only able to randomize 2 patients over, I think it was about a 6-month period. But that came down to lack of interest by the clinicians, even though they had said they were very interested in doing the trial. So these things don't always work out. Anyway, that's sort of my summary of the trial that they mention here, and also their platform that they've built, or processes anyway that they've built in order to do pragmatic trials. And I'd be interested in what people think of their approach and whether it could work in British Columbia.
Great, thanks, Penny. Sterling here. I think I can hear some background. Oh, right, okay. I hope you can hear me okay. There's probably some background noise here as well. I'm actually quite interested. I mean, like, fundamentally, I think, like, this is exactly the sort of trial that we should be doing, especially when we're talking about patient-oriented research. So I sort of think the link between SPORE and real-world clinical trials makes perfect sense. So I think, like, just as a starting point, I would be quite interested in hearing people's views on like whether they support doing pragmatic trials, doing real-world clinical trials, and what level of interest there is in that. Because I think like if we can gauge that interest, then like the next step obviously is to see how we can actually move in this direction.
So maybe Hubert would like to comment on this from his experience at St. Paul's.
I don't know if it's sort of experience from St. Paul's, but just more generally, I think a lot of the trials that we're doing now are starting to sort of have more and more aspects of pragmatism and real worldness to it. And I think the things that I'm sort of encountering, which are sort of bothering me, is like what do we have to change in order to make these trials work? Because I mean, once you get out of sort of the traditional clinical trial, there's all sorts of things which can, for lack of a better phrase, go wrong. And so you have to sort of accept that things aren't going to be ideal, but it's always fuzzy what you should accept and what you shouldn't accept. And I guess that's what I'd like to hear other people's views on, is like, how practical is doing pragmatic trials?
I think, Don, you've got a lot of experience in actually conducting clinical trials. I mean, like if we were to move it towards more pragmatism in clinical trials being done in the intensive care unit, is that something that you think is feasible, desirable?
Yeah, no, there's no doubt there's a huge amount of interest, particularly in the Canadian Critical Care Trials group, about moving towards that. And I think, as Hubert sort of said, there's a element of pragmatism being inserted because, we get these efficacy or these effectiveness studies, and we don't really know what to do with it because how does it apply to my patient, which is always the age-old problem. I think if you sort of said what are the barriers, I think, and not knowing anything about pragmatic RCT, it seems to me one of the things that helps facilitate these things is in fact, and Penny and I were talking about this the other day, is a robust EMR with good outcomes that we can ascertain, so that you can build on these pragmatic RCTs and do them over multiple sites and have multiple different comparator arms. And I think right now that's our biggest barrier, in the fact that we don't really have a robust electronic medical record, I think, in order for us to get these outcomes in real time. We're always looking back and collecting our data. We're always 2 to 3 months behind. So maybe with the advent of an EMR and a provincial EMR, these would be things that we could really do, I think, pretty important fundamental questions. I'm very supportive of this, but I wonder what anyone else's thoughts are on that particular aspect.
I suppose, Alison, you've got a lot of experience in the clinical trials field, sort of conducting regulatory trials, but also other trials. And now, as Clinical Trials BC sort of moves forward, then I guess moving into this space is going to be important. I mean, do you see the interest in this and potential feasibility?
Hi, Sterling. Thanks. As I just joined a bit late, I was just listening to the last couple comments. And one of the things, and I agree about the having an EMR that you can sort of integrate into research in a feasible way, and identify research subjects in a way you can meet with concerns around the confidentiality and access issues. But also, one of the things that I've noticed more from the operational side is when you're working with investigators and research teams that have worked in heavily regulated trials and RCT trials, and they transition into some more real-world or pragmatic trials. We're currently working with a team that's working on the Tech for Home project. Some of this, and this has happened in some other sort of post-marketing or comparative effectiveness trials, is the difficulty of navigating what someone just mentioned, I think it was you, Sterling, about what do we need to control and what is okay for us to deviate from in the real world practice. And so those coming from that heavy regulated environment, it's very hard to know sometimes in the day-to-day conduct and collecting that data, what are those endpoints that we really need to be tight on, and what are the other ones that it's okay and we can just sort of collect that data, but if it's outside of certain parameters, that's okay, because knowing and having the understanding that this is a pragmatic trial. So it was more just an observation that that's something that definitely people struggle with, transitioning back and forth if they're working on both those formats within those paradigms.
So I guess like both Hubert and Alison have been sort of pushing this question of like how pragmatic or how much deviation from protocol, I suppose, would be another way of characterizing it, is acceptable in a pragmatic trial. Penny, you probably have a view on that.
Well, I mean, I suppose if we think back to the paper and the trial they talk about, you're talking about adjuvant, or not adjuvant, you're talking about prophylactic intervention that lasts, fairly short period of time while they're receiving their adjuvant chemotherapy. And so if you think about it, okay, they're getting one or the other of these things. What conditions would you want to put in place in such a trial? I think if you have a very long intervention, it may become more problematic. But if you have a fairly short intervention, then there may not be as much opportunity or you may not be as much need to control for other things.
Sorry?
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that in trials where the intervention is fairly well defined and as you point out, fairly short in duration, I'm not so concerned, but I'm more concerned about those trials, where they're occurring in multiple sites and you don't have control over the processes that are going on at each site. How do you account for that, I guess, is, do you need to?
Well, I guess that's the question. I mean, if you're simply saying, if you're given one of these two things and one turns out to be better than the other, under the circumstances of everyday practice, then is that just the question answered?
But I think like a follow-on to that then maybe is if you've got a multi-center trial and what you actually see is variation in practice between centers, should you be accounting for that variation? Is that part of the question that you're addressing, is that variation? Because that's obviously it's not a random process. How do you deal with that variation in practice across sites in this sort of setting?
And what variation are you talking about specifically? I mean, going back to the example, they were randomized to one of two treatments. So the treatment's not varying. You're getting one or the other.
Well, you're being offered one or the other, I suppose. Whether it's accepted may be different. There may be different views by the clinicians, and so there may be different levels of sort of promotion of the new therapy in one setting. So you might see quite different rates of uptake or use of the new therapy.
Well, I don't think we're allowing people to sell one over the other. I mean, that's one of the points that they make in their sort of like when they prepare using these processes. And one of the things is to have, true clinical equipoise. To your point, in the trial that didn't work at all, where they only enrolled 2 over 6 months, expecting, I think, at least 100, there, despite the 10 clinicians saying they were in clinical equipoise, when they did a post-trial survey, it turned out that at least 3 of the 10 physicians did have a preference. So there we go. A pragmatic trial isn't going to work if people have strong preferences. But in that case, it's about they just don't enroll, as opposed to, there's something that could jeopardize internal validity at the end of the trial.
Yeah, it seems to me that these are actually addressing the questions that how many times we've seen small single-center RCTs that show a strong effect, and then when we try to replicate it across multiple sites, it's failed. And glucose control is one, that one center intensive insulin therapy, 10 randomized control trials later, failed to show any benefit, possibly even harm. So I think my understanding is that variability that you're going to see is, I assume, is probably provided that you've got reasonable stratification within center for the 2 interventions. That's going to hopefully get a real-world answer for you at the end of the day, so you're not having to replicate these single, very constrained trials. And from a clinician point of view, we're always coming back to this, that sure, we've done these one small little RCTs, these little effectiveness RCTs, but how do we actually apply that? And it seems to me this is going to do very well for these large questions where there's true equipoise. And there's lots of things we do all the time, whether it be DVT prophylaxis or stress prophylaxis, where we do these things, but we really have no idea how they're going to apply in a big real-world scenario.
So I guess that goes to the point of then, the question, and actually making sure you get the right question and who needs to be at the table in order to determine the right question. But certainly part of that has to be this sort of clinical equipoise discussion. And I guess the example that you gave, Penny, of these 2 situations where they tried to roll forward a pragmatic clinical trial. One, they thought they had clinical equipoise, but they didn't. So, I guess working on how do you actually determine whether this clinical equipoise would be important?
My experience is I think as these guys found, is the proof is in the pudding. People can tell you they're excited about a trial and say that they'll recruit patients and they're happy to randomize them, but then it gets going and they don't. And I think often, I'm not sure how you protect against that. I don't know if Hubert has any brilliant ideas, but like I say, I think it's sort of like they walk the talk or not. So they do one talking and then they do different walking. But that's not really a feature of pragmatic trials. That's a feature of any trial.
Yeah, that's true. I understand. Yeah, that's definitely the case. So I was particularly interested in the ethics issue here, and the ethics process, the consent process that they were able to employ in this situation seems a million miles from the consent process that I'm used to in clinical trials in BC.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been a group of people who have argued for a very, very long time that the process that perhaps the lawyers have handed us does not actually result in informed consent. I mean, I like this idea of verbal consent. I think in the TASTE trial, which was one of the first really, really large pragmatic trials, they did oral consent, but in the end they did have, a 2-page written consent afterwards. The idea here that they documented the conversation had happened in the EMR is quite interesting. But I guess I think, like, with the harmonization of the ethics in BC, maybe we can move towards this oral consent idea, because the last thing I want to see, which is what other people say pragmatic trials should be able to do, is not get consent at all. So there's lots of arguments around pragmatic trials, like, for example, this breast cancer one. There are 2 treatments. Anybody could have gotten any of them. They're standard of care. So why do we have to tell the patient their choice was by a random assignment? Allison, do you have any idea how oral consent would go over in BC?
I think it definitely initially is going to require, of course, the education and some real-life examples, particularly in the Canadian environment. But I think more and more, and speaking to some ethics board members recently, going back to the survey we did about issues with declining recruitment and the burden of consent that we're hearing from the patients, people at the time they're becoming much more open to this, and especially on reducing that burden on the participant and on the clinicians administering it, especially in a pragmatic environment. And also going back to that comment, are they really understanding, and what are they consenting to? More and more they're saying, well, this is just legal stuff, it's not really relevant, they're skipping through it. So what are we trying to accomplish? So I think the conversations have changed a lot in the last 5 years, and the pendulum is swinging, so the timing is pretty good.
Does anyone ever do, like, 2-stage consenting? You sort of get the initial approval, and then you say, well, here's a document with more detailed information, and you go have a look and see if you still agree.
Actually, we used to do that at our site a lot. Our consent process tended to be very 2-stage, and I think a lot of coordinators do this by default, and they'll introduce just the basics initially, and sometimes just have a 1-pager information sheet that's approved by the REB that they can take home to their family or discuss with their doctor, or have a letter, a summary, and then they've kind of made that decision, and then it's sort of go through the full consent form. But they've already made that initial decision whether or not to participate based on the summary or the conversation that they just had verbally.
Right. I mean, for Hubert, one thing that I'm very interested in is there's been some work where patients have gone through consents, the 15-page boilerplate, and identified what they feel is important for patients to know and what they feel is less important for patients to know. And I'd be very interested in a more interactive consent process where, as the patient, it's done on a tablet or whatever, it's a bit of a decision tree. As the patient goes through, they can look at more information or not, and it's sort of, they're up to them what it is they want to know more about and what it is they want to know less about. So I think, it's almost like tailored to each individual how much information they want. And it reminds me of, I can't remember the name of the scale, where they ask patients, are you someone who likes to make decisions about your medical care, or the other end of the scale is you just leave it up to your physician to make decisions. So I think, having an oral consent, but also maybe for other things, having somewhere where you could have a responsive consent process to the information needs of the patient would be interesting.
That can be part of your methods cluster project.
Hey, Don, what do you think of that idea?
Yeah, no, I think it's great. We have a very different, like, we often, just because of our environment, we often use a deferred consent model
Yeah.
because a lot of our interventions, our patients are so sick and it's so acute, we have no option. We can't get true informed consent. I
Yeah.
guess it depends a lot, and often even sometimes waived consent. So we did a laryngoscopy trial. And, so I guess to Sterling's point, it depends on what the intervention is. If there's true equipoise, we've got absolutely no idea, like what is it a PPI for gastroprophylaxis versus ranitidine? Like, no one has any idea. So should patients be aware that they're participating? Yes. Do you need consent if you want to contact them post-discharge? Absolutely. That's usually what we get the consent for when it's waived consent, or I mean deferred. It's so that we have the ability to get their data upon discharge. But just to go through this entire process for these true, I would liken it, maybe naively, to cluster RCTs. Well, if you do a cluster RCTs, well, you don't get patient consent, you just randomize the hospitals. Well, the patients have no choice in that either, yet they're still participating. So I don't know. I think a lot of it has to do with what the intervention is and what you're getting consent for. So I personally don't really have that much of an issue in trying to simplify the consent process. And I totally agree with you. Sometimes you sit down with families, Penny, and they're like, listen, I'm happy to participate, whatever you think is best. I'm like, well, I don't know what's best. That's why we're doing this. And some people want, and they just don't want to be guinea pigs, and they want to participate regardless of what you do. So, yeah, tailored consent makes a lot of sense.
Well, I mean, I think, you'd have to start with trials where, as in the breast cancer trial, they're very, either one's used, nobody has any, strong view on one or the other. They're very, very different in price. I'm not sure there's much point in this, to maybe you can talk to Sterling. Is there any point in doing this if there's really no price differential?
Is there any point in doing a pragmatic trial if there's basically like no cost difference between the options being compared? Is that the question?
Yeah. And let's say toxicity profiles are the same as well.
So then, like, I guess the alternative would be to do a more traditional clinical trial.
Well, I mean, typically when you're contemplating a pragmatic trial, the explanatory trial's already been done. So it just it comes back to the idea that, like, a pragmatic trial is usually done in collaboration with the policymakers. So if the two things cost the same, the side effects are the same, presumably the policymakers just don't care which one you use.
Yeah, I guess in that situation, yes, I think that probably is the case. But I think that's probably a fairly rare circumstance. I suspect that in a lot of situations, I mean, we certainly want to focus on areas where there's a relatively big cost difference, but also potentially areas where there's a pretty big difference in outcome as well.
Right, but I think again in pragmatic trials, you're typically, as this breast cancer trial with the prophylaxis is, the outcomes are basically the same. We know that, at least in an explanatory framework, we know that. But it's interesting because, we could think about the decision tree for do you do pragmatic trial, and the first question could be, is there a big cost difference? No, well then just stop.
Yeah, but I guess one of the other sort of things that I think is important here is the fact that your clinical population in your explanatory trial may actually be very atypical of the clinical population who might receive it in reality, in practice. So you can't, just because you have that finding from the explanatory trial doesn't mean it's going to be replicated in a pragmatic trial, does it?
No, but it also, I'm not sure it speaks to the pragmatic trial as much as explanatory trials should be larger and able to answer questions of treatment effect modifications, which they really can't do now, most of them. So, because then, talking about control, I mean, imagine the bigger explanatory trial where you have sufficient sample size in the subgroups most of interest. You are figuring out, does this not work in, for example, females? we've got everything under control, and in that subgroup it simply didn't work. If you just go straight to a pragmatic trial, then without those, without that tight control, I think it can get lost. So I
think that's a really important point. That, in some ways, the touted benefit of the pragmatic trial being the more representative clinical population may actually be. I think you shouldn't be. Yeah, you should actually be exploring that variation, sort of by subgroup or whatever, in the context of the explanatory trial.
Right, because I see pragmatic trials not just increasing eligibility, but also more in terms of, loosening the reins on that practitioner. And also, again, if you look at the 9 points, you're doing less monitoring, you're happy, you're okay with not quite so great adherence, you're never going to have a run-in period. The setting is where it's actually going to be delivered in the end. So I think, to me, if you really want to know about treatment effect modification, then we sort of need to move upstream to the explanatory trials.
So I'm conscious that we've got a couple of other people on the call who, so no pressure, but please feel free to contribute to the conversation or give an opinion if you're wanting to. I just wanted to make sure that people feel comfortable doing that. So just going back to the consent issue and pushing that one. I guess under an Academic Health Science Network banner, we now have Clinical Trials BC, the BC Support Unit, and also Research Ethics BC. So I think there's an opportunity for us to have that conversation under an AHSN banner and bring in that sort of ethics perspective. I guess, Alison, maybe your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's something, definitely it makes sense, and I think that part of the objective or the vision of bringing those groups together under this network is so that we can facilitate these conversations and innovate in these areas. So I think that would be a good outcome from this meeting, Journal Club.
So, Alison, do you think that there'll be, that there would be much use in sort of having that, I'll call it theoretical discussion, or do you think they're just going to come back, like give us an example, or as in like if we find a trial that is pragmatic and we want to use a integrated consent model, that then we start the conversation?
Yeah, it might be helpful to have definitely more education around it and examples, like you say, of use, successful use, other institutional REBs in Canada that have approved other forms or methods that they've approved and examples of it. Mm-hmm. And definitely, the background and the rationale and all of those things in place, even maybe before approaching the conversation, yeah.
Okay.
And again, the patient voice too, perhaps we want to think about including the patient perspective and why this is something also, that kind of a consent is also, you were talking about the responsive consent, and it's making me think, well, that's patient-driven consent, that patients are making those choices. And I know at the last N2 Network of Networks conference with research coordinators and investigators, and industry was there too, somebody presented from back east, and I'd have to look and see who it was, but they were suggesting in regards to innovating consent forms, switching more to like a decision aid type model that they've used successfully in when patients are trying to determine what types of care they would like to receive and how to make those decisions, these one-page decision aids, and then they showed examples of using that for make a decision about participating in a clinical trial. And they have data to support that it's much more effective to do than just reading through the consent form. So perhaps doing a bit of a scan of what's currently out in Canada, and maybe our colleagues in the UK, some other examples there, I'm not sure. I think that could be helpful, though. Absolutely.
Wow, I think if you could share that, I think that would be really, I'd love to see the use of decision aids in that context. I'd never heard of that, but it just seems pretty, yeah, I mean, that sounds like a great idea and something that could be quite effective. And of course, we do have folks in BC who are doing work on developing decision aids and testing decision aids, so we could maybe even bring some other people together on that topic. Yeah, this could be. Yeah, I think this could be something the methods cluster might be wanting to move forward with. Hubert?
Possibly, yeah. I'm still sort of a few steps back here thinking about other things.
Well, you could share those other things with us.
Well, it sort of goes back to the issue of sort of what's ethical and in terms of getting consent. And I'd spoken with a few people about this, but when you have trials, and you ask people to consent, it's kind of like in many cases, it's just an all or none thing, right? You know, you're part of this trial or you're not. But in fact, there are situations where even the person doesn't consent to the trial, it could be important to evaluate what their outcomes are. And, you know, obviously if you need their consent to get that outcome, then it's a no-go situation. But, you know, if it's an outcome that's collected in routinely, or which you can extract from, you know, administrative databases or something like that, you know, when is it permissible for you to access that data? And, you know, under what conditions should you be allowed to access that data? So I'm sort of talking about a different issue than consent, but it's related because I think the whole problem with not getting consent is, you know, you potentially can end up with non-representative samples, and I'm just trying to think of ways around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when looking at their example with the prophylaxis in the breast cancer for neutropenia or febrile neutropenia, you know, if you have really high rates of participation, then we don't really need to worry about it. You know, what you talk about, I'm sure you know, was advanced quite a while ago called the comprehensive cohort design, where you had a cohort of people and some of them agreed to be randomized and they were in the clinical trial, and basically the rest of the cohort, the comprehensive cohort, was followed for the endpoints for, you know, to see how they fared, but also to get more information. And that design sort of fell out of favor because basically the cost of collecting the information on those who didn't really, you know, give you anything in terms of internal validity was so, the cost benefit wasn't there. But as you say, if you could collect that kind of data routinely, I mean, with consent, but at least routinely, then that cost benefit ratio would really change, and maybe the comprehensive cohort design would come back into favor.
What do you think about the situation where you don't even have consent from them? Do you think it's still allowable to get their data?
I'm a big proponent of consent. I'm sorry. So the way I look at it is you either get consent or you have legislation. And this fuzzy in between, I'm not that happy with. But I'm completely against pragmatic trials where people argue you don't need consent. I mean, you've chosen a treatment by randomization, and that should be revealed to the patient.
Are you arguing against that, Hubert?
I'm not sure what I'm arguing for or against at this point. That's why I think this might be something worth pursuing as a project in the methods cluster. I guess there's just different shades of gray amongst all this, and I don't know where the line should be drawn.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think in some circumstances it might be okay, even to use someone's data, even if they haven't given consent. I mean, we do it all the time in secondary data analysis, right? As long as it's done in such a way that the patients can't be identified.
But we also do it when patients can be identified, and we do it following the guidelines. But I think it's a little bit of a cop-out, because our cop-out's always like, it's impractical to try and contact these people. So, there's sort of this out, right?
But going back to Alison's point about, if we're going to go to ethics committees and suggest, certainly, very different approaches to consent in pragmatic trials, and drawing on examples. I mean, obviously, in this, in Ontario, in Ottawa, they got consent. They went through an ethics board, and so they've got. There are examples in Canada that we can then draw upon, and I think we need to be sort of starting that conversation with ethics boards if we want to move in this direction.
I've got a question then for somebody, or I don't know if someone knows. What do they do, Penny, you might know, with these large sort of adaptive platform trials in the U.S.? What's the consent model for that?
The ones that I know of are the typical consent process, because those platform trials are almost always very explanatory trials.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because you could almost, based on the conversation, you can tell there's some consternation here and some things need to be explored. But you could argue, geez, if you had an EMR, you were collecting these outcomes anyway. Yes, people need to be informed that there, some treatments being assigned by randomization. You have to figure that out. But you'd almost be, if you had the ability to get this data, we use it for secondary use anyway, with getting consent retrospectively. And it's almost like a missed opportunity where really all these patients that are coming into the hospital, particularly when we have EMR and we have all these outcomes, we should be looking at all these things. And you could even look at multiple interventions with people as well, much like they do with these platforms trials.
I agree with you, and I think that route is legislation.
Totally. Well, even that's what they've done. They've recanted that in the UK, I think, but that's what they had done up till recently in some of the ICUs in the UK. They get people's consent up front for coming into the intensive care unit to collect and use their data.
Yeah, but I'm just talking about legislation. The legislation that we have today in Canada, in most places, recognizes autonomy as the number one thing, and that's all, fine and good. But I think, rather than having this sort of it's impractical, then you can do it, I think they should have legislation that allows us better and easier and more secure access to the data, and informing the public of that whole thing, but with real penalties applied to people who abuse that. But I think, to me, this whole secondary use thing, to have it, really have a learning health system and really be able to use it, suggests that legislation should change.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great comment, actually, and I think, it goes back to the sort of frame within the Academic Health Science Network, because certainly, Tom is talking very strongly about, building a learning health system in BC, and obviously, the data piece is huge. And I was always working on the assumption that within that context, you would be conducting pragmatic clinical trials, and so I think if we're saying that that's the direction of travel, then we need to then start having this conversation about legislation and changing legislation in order to facilitate that.
Yeah, we need to have some deliberative democracy to support that for sure.
Yeah. No, indeed. Yeah. No, that would be the right approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, without deliberative democracy and the public buy-in, you're not going to get a politician to sign off on it anyway.
Yeah. True.
So,
Absolutely.
Anyway, see, we're close to our ending time. So, is there? Do you want to wrap up, Sterling, or anybody? Any last comments?
So I'm not hearing any last comments, but I'd like to say a very big thank you to Penny for leading the discussion and sharing the paper, and everyone for joining. I think that's been a good discussion, and I think we'll sort of reflect and maybe get some actions that we might want to take forward, and certainly bring others within HSN into the conversation. Sounds like there's a dog that needs feeding in the background, so I'm sure that people are keen to... Oh dear, I'm not quite sure what's going on. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. So Pat, I don't know whether you want to say anything by way of close.
I do. I would like to extend the BC Support Unit's sincere thanks to Penny Brasher for leading this discussion, and to everybody who took time out this evening to participate in this interesting discussion, and to you, Sterling, for chiming in from wherever it is you are in public with that interesting background noise. So thanks, everyone, and all the best.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Up here. No, get up here.